I was sitting down to watch a video from one of my favorite YouTube channels last week, when the topic of walkable, transit-oriented urbanism came up. Linus of Linus Tech Tips, who's actually based near my hometown of Langley, BC, Vancouver, to everyone who doesn't live in BC, was responding to various hot takes from viewers. When someone pointed out that EVs are far less impactful for the environment than walkable, transit-oriented cities. Now, Linus, to his great credit, acknowledged this fact, but then sort of suggested that any serious, walkable, transit-oriented urbanism in North America was kind of a pipe dream, and that entire neighborhoods would need to be raised to get us there. I disagree, really strongly actually, and so here's why. If you're new here, this is RMTransit, a channel where one Canadian politely critiques another Canadian's takes on cities. Before I get everything started, I do want to acknowledge that Linus said this in a hot takes video, and he also did acknowledge that walkable, transit-oriented cities are ideal. However, he went on to share the all too common and all too cynical take that hope is kind of lost for North America, because North America is broadly car-centric today. And because of this, all hope is kind of lost for the future. If you know anything about this channel, it could be called RM optimism. So let's talk about why I think there's hope for us yet, and actually quite a lot of it. The first thing to consider is that everyone starts their life car-free, including in North America. In most places on that continent, you can't drive a car until you're 16 years old. So if you want to go somewhere without your parents driving you before then, you're going to be relying on walking, cycling, and public transportation. At the same time, as our population continues to get older and older on average, more and more people are starting to consider the safety impacts of driving, as well as the environmental costs and just costs in general. So a lot of older folks are driving less by choice and sometimes by necessity as well. That's not to mention people with disabilities or people who can't afford a car. We often seem to forget that even in North America, for a large portion of the population, simply driving is just not an easy choice they can make. Walking, cycling, and taking public transportation is the best bet a lot of people have to go out and do something, rather than staying home and building computers all day, as much as I do love doing that, and something I can do thanks to a certain channel. I think for young people in particular, not having to be driven around is a huge opportunity for independence and just personal growth. And I've seen kids riding the train or bus to school in Montreal, New York, Toronto, and indeed even in Vancouver. Something which I did when I was a kid in Vancouver and I wanted to pop over to Metrotown to go shopping with my friends or just hang around the mall. That's something that just wouldn't be possible if North America had no hope for mobility outside of cars. In fact, even in the same video later on, Linus mentions playing video games while riding the Vancouver SkyTrain. So even he has lived some portion of his life not completely oriented around cars. Even if he drove to the station and parked his car, he still made the choice to not drive somewhere, or maybe it was the best option for him, no cars involved at all. Now, Linus assumed when he first read the comment that the person saying it was from Europe. That's something you see a lot in North America. There's this broad perception that Europeans are super transit-oriented and they walk everywhere and cycle everywhere. But Linus appeared surprised when he saw that the person was actually from Salt Lake City, Utah, a city which, ironically, I just made a video about, talking about how it has actually a pretty good public transport system for what is a small Western American city. When I visited Salt Lake, I never drove anywhere. I didn't have a car, so I took buses and trains. And I think that's true for a lot of people, even traveling within North America. You'll often travel to a place and not rent a car and be able to get around using public transportation. A lot of places have rail or high-quality buses to the airport. You see, there's this common belief in the US and Canada that people in Europe are fundamentally different. And while Europe is different as a whole, it's also a large, diverse place. There are many places in North America, from downtown Vancouver to Manhattan to the Plateau in Montreal and downtown San Francisco, that are walkable in the same way that European city centers are. And Canadian cities, as I've talked about in a lot of videos in the past, are actually a lot closer to European ones on urban public transportation than a lot of people give them credit for. Sure, they're not always very comfortably walkable, but you can walk and take the train or bus for a lot of trips. It's important to recognize that even within the continent of North America, it's not a monoculture. 5 times more people take the SkyTrain in Vancouver every day than the train in Seattle or Portland. And in turn, far more people take the train to work or school or to their daily errands in Seattle or Portland than Houston or Phoenix. And for what it's worth, similar numbers of people ride the New York City subway every day as the Paris Metro or the London Underground. And of course, Europe has rural and even some suburban places where more people drive than walk or take transit. These things are just less common there, but they were sometimes more common in the past. I guess my point here is that margins matter a lot. It's unlikely that we're ever going to get rid of all of the cars in North America. But basically all of the large European cities also do still have some number of cars. They're often just more restricted, smaller, and actually more electrified than the cars in North America. It's silly to suggest that there's anything fundamental in North America that couldn't be changed that would prevent us from moving in that direction. In many ways, the simplest way you could put it is to just say that Canada is maybe 15, 20, or 30 years behind Europe on urban mobility, and the US is maybe 30 or 40. A lot of European cities were way more car dependent 30 years ago than they are today. Look at Amsterdam just a few decades ago. It was a vastly different place. But cities like Amsterdam, Paris, Madrid, and others were able to and continue to be able to change the way people get around them through concerted policy and good work. And that same work is happening in the US and Canada, maybe not as quickly as we would like, but in the next decade, Canadian cities will open over 20 new tram and subway lines as well as extensions. That's a lot of new places where transit, walking, and cycling could make a lot more sense. And where getting around without getting into a car becomes really quite comfortably possible. In fact, Vancouver is even extending the SkyTrain network out to Surrey and Langley. Now, of course, I don't expect all of the suburban residents of my hometown to just give up their cars. But that's not really the point. A single young professional living in a new condo in Fleetwood or Surrey Central could probably get by without ever needing to buy a car. And a young family who's living in a townhouse a few blocks away from a new rapid bus or train route might be able to get away with just one car. And all of these things tend to snowball. When all of your friends are living car-free or car-light, you might be a bit more open to that. And that's how society and our habits change. At the same time, cities across the continent are changing the way our streets look year by year. The progress is really consistent, even if it's unsatisfactory. We have large bike lane networks in a lot of the biggest cities in North America, and even some smaller cities are starting to get beginnings of networks. Sure, the bike lanes might not be as good as Amsterdam, but it takes time to get there. You often need to have a bike lane and people using the bike lane before you can really worry about making the bike lane very good. These are the early blossoms of growth that will continue to change and adapt over time and allow people to travel without cars. And in some senses, this should all be easier in North America than it is in Europe. If you're in France or the Netherlands or even the UK, you already have a lot of the quote-unquote easy trips being made by public transport. In North America, there's a lot of people who could or would like to take public transport, but the service isn't good enough or it doesn't reach where they're living, and they might not want to own a car. Cars are expensive and inconvenient, and they're just not for everyone. We have so much of the low-hanging fruit still existing here in North America that we could impact a lot of change quite quickly with changes in policy. When you're in a prominent European center and most of the people left owning cars are people who actually just really like cars or who actually need them for work or some other reason, well, it's a lot harder to grow the non-car transportation pie. But here in North America, there is a lot of pie to go around. Now, Linus does mention that he lives in a place where he can't really walk to anything. And I can relate. The semi-rural place I grew up had nothing around it. I would have had to walk 30 or 40 minutes to get to literally just a corner store. There was a bus, but it was an hour-and-a-half walk away, and the bus only ran once per hour. I took it a few times, but it wasn't exactly convenient. But at the same time, there are literally tons of places in North America where this isn't true. Super huge numbers of people live in suburban areas, not to mention places where there are already subway or tram lines. And we already know in places like Toronto and Vancouver that if you provide good buses and other transit service, even in the suburbs, people will get on board. As I said before, I've traveled all over Canada and the US, and while sure, if you're going to Banff National Park, you might need a car, but even going to places like that, there are actually public transport options, and if you're in a city, you're generally good without one. And at the same time, infill development is also possible, and in some places it's inevitable. Much of the land that our cities, especially in North America, lie on today was agricultural just a few decades ago. As we continue to build our cities and create better mobility options, land values go up and redevelopment happens. Buildings get old and eventually it makes sense to rebuild with higher densities. What surprises me about Linus's take is that this is extremely visible in the Vancouver area. It's one of the cities on the continent that has changed the most in the last few decades, from being fairly car-oriented with little rail options for people to get around, to being a place where there's a lot of apartments all over the place. Just looking at Surrey and Langley in the Vancouver area, there were a lot of places that were downright rural and exurban just a few decades ago that are now townhouses and apartments. Look at a place like Willoughby. This was a place that used to be houses on large multi-acre lots and is now townhomes, apartments, and dense shopping areas. And while sure, it's still rather car-oriented, this is a place that actually has public transport and where a lot of people can make many of their daily trips by walking or cycling. The Willoughbys of today, where people can live car light, can become the metro towns of tomorrow, where many people don't need a car, or at least don't want to pay for one. So while I get Linus's take that electric cars are still going to be important for decarbonizing the trips that are probably always going to be happening in cars, or more likely work vans and trucks, there is still so much opportunity to get people out of cars all around the world. Again, a place like Vancouver or even Seattle or Montreal shows that if you build the transit, you build the bike lanes, you build the bikeways, and you create new pedestrian areas and dense development, well, you can make a lot of people comfortable with living without a car or with living with less. So don't lose hope. Thanks for watching, and thanks for the tech tips.